Okay, so that for these further advanced beats that are at the bottom or the lower half of page 91 in your book, so we're looking at from K onwards. This is where we introduce the quaver rest that we've looked at on page 8 for the snare drum, but this time the quaver rest is in the bass drum part. So if we look at the beat K, we do a bass tap, snare tap, and then on the lower part there's the little 7 rest written, but we've still got a tap on the top, so that tap is on its own, there's nothing underneath it, before we then play the bass with the tap. And the bass drum note has a little tail on it to show that it's only a quaver worth rather than a crotchet, so straight to the snare on the next one. So saying it out loud as I normally do: bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, tap. Our aim with these beats is to start to feel the 4 beats in the bar, so that you're feeling that bass drum on the 3rd beat after the beat, the off beat. Bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, tap, bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, tap. So we're really trying to get into that groove. Make up some words to go with the pattern. Boom, ba, boom, ba, boom, ba, boom, ba. See if you can think of some words to go with that little pattern. For beat L, it's exactly the same, but we've added a bass drum at the end of the bar. So if you've gone through the beats at the top of page 91, you'll remember the snare, bass, bass that we were practicing before. So that's all we're adding at the end. So it sounds the same as K: bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, bass, bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, bass, bass. So you're just leading yourself back round again. Going on down, M is our other key one to get. This is because we've filled part of the gap in between the snare and the offbeat bass with another bass drum. So M does bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare. Bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare, tap. Again, if we look at the rhythm set up by the bass and snare: boom, da, boom, boom, da, boom, da, boom, boom, da. And our quavers over the top: dun, da, dun, dun, da, dun, da, dun, dun, da. So you can, again, use some words like my fish and chips ones, make up your own. Food's always a good one to use, or something to do with football, wherever you want to go. N is therefore exactly the same as M, except you have the extra bass drum at the end. So we're doing the bass, bass, back round to the beginning. Bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare, bass, bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare, bass. So we've got that one tap in the middle of M&M that has the rest underneath it. So just watching out for that one, making sure you feel that one. Carrying on down the page, O and P have a crotchet rest, that's your cat, so it's a whole beat rest. So you can fit 2 taps in a whole beat, so you've got 2 taps on their own. A little tip, whenever you've got 2 taps on their own in the middle of the bar, think, oh yeah. So we can have bass, tap, snare, bass, oh yeah, snare, tap. Okay, so you've got those 2 taps on their own. P then does exactly the same as O, you're getting the idea here, except it adds the bass drum at the end. Bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, tap, snare, bass, bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, tap, snare, bass. Again, you can use my oh yeah, if that helps get your 2 taps in the middle. The next 4 beats, Q, R, S and T, are exactly the same as K, L, M and N. The only difference is that they've got 2 bass drums on that first beat. So whereas with K you were bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare. For Q you go bass, bass, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, tap. So it just gives it a bit of extra solidness at the start. The last 4 are tricky just because you start with a tap on the hi-hat. We're used to having a really nice solid start with the bass and the hi-hat together. So this time you have to do tap, bass, snare, tap, bass, tap, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare. So you've got 2 taps, but one's at the very end of the bar and one's at the very beginning of the bar. So looking at how you can make sure that you're counting those ones. And we've got 8 quavers in your bar, so that's 8 taps on the hi-hat. So you can always just count to 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and work out what goes with it. Okay, so break it down that way. Once you're feeling really comfortable with all the beats on that page, there's 2 pieces on the following page that you can have a go at. The top one starts with the beats from page 90, so our basic rock beats, and builds its way quite quickly into using the more advanced ones at the top of page 91. And then as you get lower down onto the 3rd line, we start using some of our quaverettes in the bass drum. Now the really tricky part in this one is the last line, and because of that quaver rest at the beginning of the 2nd bar, it's better to try and learn the whole of the last line in one go, rather than doing a bar at the time, which is how we practice things quite often. So make sure you can play the 1st bar, but then add it on to the next one and the next one because of getting those taps on. So some really slow practice. So that last line of the top piece on page 92 would go bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare, tap, tap, bass, snare, tap, bass, tap, snare, bass, tap, bass, snare, bass, bass. Obviously all the time keeping that hi-hat going really nice and steady. The lower piece on page 92 has a slightly different way of being written. This is only to help you with how it sounds because of the groupings. So clearly in the 1st bar, we use our beat that's A on page 91. And we keep returning to this beat every other bar. So we've got that repetition. But the bars in between, so the 2nd bar to start with, are grouped in a 3, and then a 3, and then a 2. So we've got 8 quavers in the bar. We've still got 8 quavers in a bar. 3 plus 3 plus 2 equals 8. So you're going to make sure you keep that hi-hat steady. It's just that the pattern goes bass, bass, snare, bass, bass, snare, bass, snare, and then you're back into your other beat. So the trick with this one is to be able to keep those quavers really nice and steady all the time, getting those groupings in and playing it correctly. At the end, you can see that the last 2 bars has been written out a different way underneath. So any of those bars could be written that way. It's just easier to get the feel if it's written in its groupings. So the last two bars, bass, snare, bass, bass, snare, bass, bass, snare, bass, bass, snare, bass, bass. But if you find it easier to read it the other way, then read it the other way. Have a go at recording these and sending me a copy of what you've played. It'd be great to hear some performances. Here are mine.